Hello everyone, Steve Mitchell with the Mind of Watercolor YouTube channel, back again for another video on watercolor pencil. And in this video we're going to talk a little bit about special effects and maybe some advanced tips and tricks that you can try when you're using watercolor pencil. Let's get going. First of all, and I meant to mention this in the basic characteristics of watercolor pencil, is that watercolor pencil, like any other pencil, is erasable. However, it's only erasable while it's dry. I'll just put some down lightly here. And most of it will erase. You might have trouble. Some of the pigment might have gotten into the paper. Once you activate pencil, it's pretty nearly permanent, to about the same extent that watercolor is. Now I'm going to let that dry, but once that dries, I won't be able to erase it. I might be able to lift and move a little of it, but it's going to be very, very difficult to do. And an eraser probably will make almost no effect unless I start abrading the paper. We have only to this point talked about putting down watercolor pencil and activating it. You can, however, put down your water first. And you want to be careful with this because there's less control, much less control. So I would consider this, and I'm just painting clear water here. I would consider this a special effect. And I'll show you an instance in a minute where you would use this. With the paper already wet, go in and start drawing. What it gives you is this sort of fuzzy, watery line. Turn the pencil on its side and you can see it there flowing into the water. That's great. Gives you these interesting effects. And the only problem with that is it's permanent. You might be able to go in while it's still wet and move some of that around, but that pigment gets down into the paper because of the water, and you have a hard time, much harder time moving it around. And when it's dry, it's going to be like this. It's going to be really difficult. But it makes a really neat, interesting effect. I like taking one of these bigger Albrecht Durer Magnus pencils, which is just a fatter pencil, same kind, and doing sort of ground texture. Put down some water, turn it on its side, and do a little bit of scumbling. Has almost like a pastel look to it. Nice way to add texture. Now another way, another special effect you can add, I'm just going to paint right over this because this will be seen on top of that. Get an area wet. I don't know if you're familiar with the watercolor paint called Brusho. Anyway, Brusho is a crystalline or powdered form of watercolor. You can usually sprinkle or put into wet washes, or there's a number of ways you can use Brusho. But take a pencil. I'm going to use a Magnus because it's got a fatter lead, and an X-Acto knife, and just scrape off some of the pigment and into that wet area. Isn't that cool? Didn't spread very much because I think the water had already started to soak in, but can hit it with a little more water, maybe with a sprayer, and pull out this mini mister here. Pretty neat effect, huh? Give you something similar to sand, putting sand on your paper, or spatter, very fine spatter. So another thing you can do, and I already talked to you about line and wash. Line and wash, again, is typically using ink. In this case, there was a permanent ink pen, and then just using the watercolor pencil to color. You can use a line and wash technique with colored pencils, standard colored pencils, because they're not water soluble. You know, you might do a drawing. You might add some line hatching technique, and this is a Faber-Castell Polychromos. This is an oil-based colored pencil. Also remember that I said that their pencils are uniform across the line, so where this color exists, At least some of them, not all of them, but most of them, you will probably find a matching color in the Albrecht Durers. So now I have a little example of a drawing here. And in this case, I am going to use the same color. This is a Magnus just because I had that handy, but it exists in the smaller pencils. Now I'm adding my tone, and just like with a ink and wash, line and wash, I can activate this pencil completely and my line stays put because I've got a permanent line under there with the oil-based pencils. So I would sort of call that an advanced technique for combining mixed media. Now let me just demonstrate a couple of the techniques I'd mentioned in the last two videos. This is a little sort of study sketch I did a while back, and I've always wanted to go back in and touch it up. And colored pencil or watercolor pencil is the perfect way to do that. So this will sort of put into perspective all of the techniques, or several of the techniques that we've been talking about. First of all, I've always felt like I need to sharpen up some of the detail in these rocks here. So I'm going to choose to do that with watercolor pencil. And I'm going to give some areas a little bit of contrast and some edges where the edges need some crisping up, so to speak. And that's great. I've added a little more definition to that area. Now I'm going to go ahead and activate it. Otherwise I could have just used a colored pencil, a standard colored pencil. I'm going to activate it in case I ever do any more touch up. I won't get some unexpected activation. And this sort of sets the color in. It also will darken it a little bit more, which is what I want. But I've added some nice crisp definition to some areas that I felt were lacking. Layering, let's talk about layering. I want to just deepen some values in this shrubbery here, and I've got a watercolor pencil that's a little bluer, a little less yellow-green. So I'm putting some shading in where I want to see these values get deeper and maybe a little bluer. Now I'm going to go back and activate that. And that's a nice layering technique that mixes with the color below. Adds another little pop of contrast in that area. Also, I want to brighten the color up here, make it a little yellower. So I don't want much though, so I'm just putting in just some light, just a very light shading of this yellow. I can see it starting to turn yellow, and I know it's going to get a little bit, rinse my brush out, it's going to get a little bit more intense when I activate it. Now I've sort of added a warm color cast to that, and this whole area has gotten more colorful. Watercolor pencil is just a great touch-up for things like that. Okay, let's bring one of my special effects in. I'm going to completely wet this whole area. Just making sure it's all thoroughly wet, soaking into the paper. Now I'm going to take this brown watercolor pencil while it's wet. And I'm going to switch to a lighter brown. Okay, maybe switch back to a darker brown just to mix them. And I like that texture there. And if I want to soften it I can go back with some water. Just so many possibilities with watercolor pencil. If you've not tried it, I hope you'll try it. If you have watercolor pencils, I hope you'll get them out and experiment with some of these techniques. Thanks. I've so enjoyed bringing you these videos. Bye-bye.